The autumn assembly at Hartwell was held, as it had been held for 30 years, in the long room above the inn, with the same fiddles and the same punch bowl, and the same families arriving in the same careful order of precedence. The candles had been lit an hour too early, and the windows steamed against the October dusk, and the room smelled of warm tallow and rain-dampened wool, and the sharp, sweet punch that Mrs. Calder mixed from the same recipe every year. Eleanor Prescott arrived on foot, alone, in a dress she had turned twice at the seams, and pressed that morning with an iron she had heated herself. She was 33 years old. She had not attended the assembly in 4 years, and her return to it was not a decision she had made with any confidence. She had made it because Adah Ashworth, who was 12 and fierce, and had been her piano pupil for 6 weeks, had asked her to come, and Eleanor had discovered that she could refuse the child nothing. She did not see him at first. She saw his mother, Lady Ashworth, seated in the chair nearest the hearth, with the particular authority of a woman who had occupied that chair for 2 decades and did not intend to relinquish it. She saw Mrs. Sophia Langley beside her, young and fair, and recently widowed, dressed in half-mourning silk, the color of a winter sky. She saw the Reverend Mr. Collins and his wife, and the Fentons from Barley Cross, and Mrs. Calder herself with the ladle still in her hand. Then she saw him. Lord Philip Ashworth, Earl of Dunmore, stood near the far window with a glass he had not touched. He wore gray. His wife had died that spring, and the month since had carved something from his face that Eleanor could not name, though she recognized the absence. He was 38. His shoulders were broader than she remembered, and his hair had gone gray above the temples, and his jaw held the same unmoving line it had held when she was 18, and foolish enough to believe that a man's stillness in her presence meant something she was permitted to keep. 15 years. She felt the number in her body before her mind would let her count it. A heat rose from her collarbone to her throat, and her hand found the back of the nearest chair, and she stood very still in the doorway of the long room while the October rain tapped the glass behind her. He had not yet seen her. He would. The room was not large enough for him not to, and it was not kind enough to let her leave before he did. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the past waiting for you like a held breath, stay close. This story knows that feeling. Philip turned his head. His gaze moved across the room without hurry, as though he were counting the candles or the faces or the cracks in the plaster ceiling, and then it reached her and stopped. His hand tightened on the glass. He did not move, did not nod, did not cross the room as any other acquaintance might have done. He simply looked at her with an expression that was not surprise, and was not coldness, and was not welcome. It was recognition, the kind that does not announce itself because it has never left. Eleanor looked away first. She always had. She moved to the far side of the room, accepted a cup of punch from Mrs. Calder, and stood near the Fentons, who were discussing the harvest rains with the meticulous tedium of people who had discussed nothing else for a month. Eleanor listened. She smiled. She held her cup with both hands because one hand alone would have trembled, and she would not give the room that. The room had already given itself permission to notice. Mrs. Fenton leaned toward her husband and murmured something that included the words, "Poor Miss Prescott," and still, after all these years, and Eleanor heard it the way she had learned to hear such things, as weather, as the sound the world made when it had decided what you were. Lady Ashworth had not looked at her once. This was itself a verdict. Eleanor had not always been the woman who arrived at assemblies on foot and alone. 15 years earlier, in the summer of her 18th year, she had been the eldest daughter of Mr. George Prescott of Hartwell Lodge, a man of modest fortune and excellent library, who had raised his 2 daughters with the conviction that a well-read woman was a well-armed one. The lodge had been a white house on 3 acres, with a garden that sloped toward the river, and Eleanor had grown up inside it the way a vine grows inside a wall, so thoroughly that the shape of the house was the shape of her happiness. Her father had taken her to London for 1 season. It was the only one he could afford, and he had told her so plainly, and she had loved him for the honesty of it. She had worn a white dress her mother had worn 20 years before, let out at the bodice and taken in at the waist, and she had danced 3 times at Lady Pemberton's ball, and once at the Midsummer Assembly at Hartwell, and on that last occasion Lord Philip Ashworth, newly come into his title at 23 and not yet engaged, had stood beside the piano while she played a Clementi sonata, and had not moved for the duration of the piece. She had looked up when the last note faded and found him watching her with an expression she would spend 15 years trying to forget and failing. He had said nothing. He had inclined his head, once, the way a man acknowledges something he cannot yet afford to name, and then his mother had appeared at his elbow and steered him across the room to Miss Charlotte Fenwick, whose fortune was £12,000, and whose father controlled 2 seats in Parliament. 3 months later, Philip married Charlotte. Eleanor's father, who had spent the last of his money on her season, suffered a stroke that winter and died the following spring. The lodge was sold to cover debts Eleanor had not known existed. Her younger sister Mary was taken in by an aunt in Bath. Eleanor, who had no aunt and no fortune and no husband, had done what women in her position did. She had found employment. She taught the pianoforte to the daughters of families who had once received her as a guest, and she lived in 2 rooms above the apothecary's shop in Hartwell Village, and she was, to the neighborhood, a woman the world had set aside. She did not complain. She did not speak of the lodge or the season or the white dress. She played beautifully, and she was patient with her pupils, and she kept her rooms clean and her accounts precise, and if the village called her the music teacher, she let them, because the name was true, and because the truer name, the one that lived beneath it, was not anyone's business. 6 weeks before the assembly, a letter had arrived at Eleanor's rooms. It bore the Dunmore seal, and Eleanor had held it for a full minute before opening it, her thumb pressed against the wax as though she could keep whatever was inside from reaching her. The letter was from Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper at Dunmore Hall, and it asked whether Miss Prescott would be willing to instruct Miss Adah Ashworth in the pianoforte, 2 mornings a week at the hall. The fee was generous. The tone was courteous. The letter did not mention Lord Ashworth. It did not need to. Eleanor had accepted. She needed the income. She told herself this was the reason, and it was not entirely untrue. The first morning she walked up the long gravel drive to Dunmore Hall. The elms were just beginning to turn, and the light through their canopy fell in gold coins on the path before her. She had not been inside the hall in 15 years. The last time, she had been a guest at a dinner, seated beside a young clergyman who talked about the weather, while Philip sat across the table and did not look at her once. She remembered the exact weight of that evening, the particular quality of being unseen by someone whose seeing would have changed everything. Mrs. Baines met her at the side entrance and led her through the servants' corridor to the music room, which was at the east end of the house and had a window overlooking the garden. The piano was a Broadwood, finer than anything Eleanor had played in years, and she touched the keys before she sat down, running her fingers across the ivory the way one touches something borrowed. Adah arrived late, scowling, with her hair half-pinned and her face closed like a fist. She was small for 12, dark-haired like her father, and she sat at the piano bench with the rigid posture of a child who has been told to do something and intends to do it as badly as possible. Eleanor recognized the posture. She had seen it in a dozen pupils. She had never seen it worn with quite so much grief. "Shall we begin with scales?" Eleanor said. "I hate scales," Adah said. "Everyone hates scales. We will do them anyway, and then we will play something you like." Adah's mouth twitched. It was not a smile. It was the place where a smile would be once the grief permitted it. They played for an hour. Adah's technique was clumsy and her timing uncertain, and she stopped 3 times to press her palms against her eyes. And Eleanor waited each time without comment and without moving from her chair. And when Adah was ready, she simply said, "From the 3rd bar." And they continued. By the end of the hour, Adah had played a simple country air all the way through without stopping, and the scowl had softened into something that looked almost like concentration. Eleanor was gathering her music when she heard the door. She turned and found Philip standing in the doorway of the music room with one hand on the frame. He wore a dark coat and no cravat, as though he had come from his study in haste, and his face held the expression she had seen at the assembly, the one that was not surprise, and not coldness, and not welcome. He looked at Adah, who was still at the bench, and then he looked at Eleanor. "Miss Prescott," he said. His voice was low, level, the voice of a man who measures every word as a cost. "I did not know Mrs. Baines had engaged you. Your housekeeper was kind enough to write," Eleanor said. "I hope the arrangement is satisfactory." "It is." He paused. His jaw moved once, the small unconscious motion of a man swallowing something he had not meant to say. "Adah, go and find Mrs. Baines. Tell her you want breakfast." Adah left. Eleanor was alone with him for the first time in 15 years, in a room that smelled of beeswax and old wood and the faint ghost of Charlotte's perfume, which still clung to the curtains the way such things do in houses where grief has not yet finished its work. "You play as well as you ever did," Philip said. "I play for a living now, my lord. One improves through necessity." He looked at her. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have too much to say, and no vocabulary that would not cost them something. He inclined his head, the same gesture he had made 15 years ago beside the piano, and left without another word. That afternoon, in the morning room at Dunmore Hall, Lady Ashworth sat with Mrs. Langley and poured tea with the particular precision of a woman who arranges the world, 1 cup at a time. "The music teacher was here this morning," Lady Ashworth said. She did not use Eleanor's name. She did not need to. The reduction was the point. "I was not consulted about the engagement. Miss Prescott teaches several families in the village, I believe," Mrs. Langley said. "She is the music teacher. Nothing more. I will speak to Mrs. Baines about the arrangement. Adah does not need a connection to that woman's history." Mrs. Langley sipped her tea and said nothing, which was itself a kind of agreement. The lessons continued. Philip did not appear again at the music room door for the first week, and Eleanor told herself she was relieved. She taught Adah with the same patience she brought to all her pupils, and Adah, who had not willingly played a note in the 6 months since her mother's death, began to play with something that was not yet joy and was not yet grief, and was perhaps the space between the two where music lives. On the 2nd Tuesday, Eleanor arrived early. The music room was empty, and she sat at the Broadwood and played the Clementi Sonata she had played 15 years ago at the Midsummer Assembly, the one she had been playing when Philip stood beside the piano and did not move. She played it from memory because the sheet music had been lost years ago, 1 page at a time, in the moves between rooms and houses, and the small erosions of a life lived without shelves enough to hold what mattered. She did not know Philip was listening. He stood in the corridor outside the music room with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, and he heard every note, and his hand went to the breast pocket of his coat where something small and folded lived, and he pressed his palm flat against it as though he could keep the sound from reaching whatever was inside. Adah appeared behind him. She looked at her father, at his closed eyes and his hand at his chest, and she did not speak. She waited until the sonata ended, and then she walked into the music room and sat at the bench. And Philip opened his eyes and went back to his study without a word. It was during Adah's fourth lesson that Eleanor saw what she had not expected to find. Adah was struggling with a passage, repeating the same 4 bars with increasing frustration, and Eleanor placed her own hand over the child's on the keys, gently, and said, "Listen, the note wants to go here. You are fighting it because you think it should go somewhere else, and you are wrong, and that is all right, because the music will teach you where it wants to go if you let it." Adah looked up at her. The child's eyes were wet, and Eleanor understood that they were not wet because of the passage. They were wet because no one had spoken to her like that since spring, with patience and directness and the quiet assumption that she was capable of more than her grief suggested. "My mother did not play," Adah said. "She said she wished she could." "Then we will play for her," Eleanor said. "That is what music is for." Philip, who had come to the corridor to tell Adah it was time for her walk, heard this. He stood very still. He did not enter the room. He watched Eleanor's hand over his daughter's on the keys, and something in his face broke open and sealed itself again so quickly that only a person who had studied that face for 15 years would have recognized the fracture. The assembly rooms at Hartwell hosted a concert the following week, a modest affair with a quartet from the county and refreshments in the anteroom. Eleanor attended because Adah was to play a short piece as part of the program, and Adah had asked her to be present. And Eleanor had discovered, again, that she could not refuse the child. Mrs. Langley was there, radiant in dove-gray silk, seated beside Lady Ashworth in the front row. When Eleanor entered, Mrs. Langley turned to the woman beside her and said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as Eleanor's ears, "Surely they do not mean the music teacher. I was told the performers tonight were of some standing." The woman beside her, Mrs. Fenton, colored and said nothing. Eleanor heard it. She folded her hands in her lap and watched Adah take the bench, and she did not look at Mrs. Langley, and she did not look at Philip, who was seated 3 rows behind his mother, with his arms folded across his chest, and his gaze fixed on the back of Eleanor's head, with an intensity that the candlelight could not quite hide. Adah played. She stumbled once, recovered, and finished with a clarity that surprised the room. Eleanor's hands were clenched in her lap so tightly that her knuckles ached. When Adah stood and curtsied, Eleanor saw the child look directly at her, not at her father, not at her grandmother, and smile. Philip saw it too. He saw where his daughter looked for approval, and he saw who had earned it. The wound that Philip carried was not one the village could see. He had married Charlotte Fenwick in the winter of his 23rd year because his mother had arranged it, and because Charlotte's fortune would repair the estate's debts, and because he had been 23 and had believed that duty and love were the same thing, or could be made to become it. Charlotte had been kind, composed, and unhappy. She had known from the first year that his attention wandered to a place she could not reach, and she had never said so, and her silence had been its own form of reproach, steady and patient, and worse than any accusation. In March, when the fever took hold, Charlotte had called him to her bedside. She was pale, diminished, the bones of her face showing through skin that had gone nearly translucent. She had taken his hand and said, in a voice thinned by fever and by 15 years of knowing, "You loved her. You always loved her. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I am dying, and I should like to say one true thing before I go." He had not denied it. He had held her hand and said nothing. And Charlotte had closed her eyes and died 3 days later. and Philip had carried her words in the breast pocket of his coat ever since. Folded into the page of sheet music he had kept for 15 years, the page Eleanor had left on the piano at the Midsummer Assembly, the page with the Clementi Sonata, the page that smelled, after all this time, of nothing at all. If this story has found you at a moment when you understand what it costs to wait, to hold something unfinished inside you for years, without knowing whether it will ever be completed, you are not alone in that. Stay. Eleanor did not know about the page. She did not know about Charlotte's words. She knew only that Philip had married another woman 15 years ago, and that the woman had died, and that the village was watching her now with the particular attention reserved for women whose old attachments have been made newly inconvenient by death. The weeks passed. October deepened. The elms shed their leaves, and the gravel drive to Dunmore Hall grew slippery with rain, and Eleanor walked it twice a week with her music case under her arm and her back straight, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who is doing her work, and nothing more. Philip appeared at the edge of her lessons more often now. He brought Adah her coat when the room grew cold. He told Eleanor to sit when he found her standing at the piano for the 3rd hour. He sent Mrs. Baines with tea and did not stay to drink it. Each of these acts was small enough to be nothing, and specific enough to be something. And Eleanor, who had spent 15 years learning to read nothing into his behavior, could not stop her body from reading everything. Once, when she was leaving the hall in a hard rain, he appeared at the side entrance with an umbrella and said, "Take this. The path is washed out past the bridge. I have walked in rain before, my lord." "Take it," he said again, and his voice was not unkind and not warm, and not anything she could hold. It was a command, and the command was protection, and she took the umbrella and walked home with his initials pressed into the handle against her palm. The dinner was Lady Ashworth's idea. She held it at Dunmore Hall on the last Saturday of October, and she invited the families of the district. And she seated Mrs. Langley at Philip's right hand and Eleanor at the far end of the table, below the curate and above the curate's mother, in the seat reserved for women whose presence was a concession rather than an invitation. Adah had asked that Eleanor attend. Lady Ashworth had permitted it, because refusing would have required acknowledging that Eleanor mattered enough to refuse. The evening was long and bright and terrible. Eleanor sat in her twice-turned dress and ate food she could not taste, and listened to the conversation flow above and around her the way water flows around a stone, touching it everywhere and carrying it nowhere. Mrs. Langley was luminous. She spoke of her travels in Italy and her late husband's collection of miniatures and the improvements she hoped to see in the village school, and every word was pitched to the frequency of a woman who belongs. Halfway through the second course, Eleanor heard her name spoken at the far end of the table. A guest, Mr. Hargrove of the county bench, was leaning toward his wife and saying, not quite quietly enough, "They say the music teacher was seated above her station. Lady Ashworth must have miscounted." Eleanor's hand tightened on her fork. She set it down. She placed both hands in her lap and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she did not look at Philip, who was at the head of the table with his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on Mr. Hargrove with the silent, concentrated fury of a man deciding whether to speak. He did not speak. Not yet. After the meal, Lady Ashworth stood in the drawing-room and addressed the assembled company with the practiced ease of a woman delivering news she has already decided is settled. "I am pleased to share with our friends tonight a piece of happy news," she said. She looked at Philip, who was standing near the mantel with his hands behind his back. "My son, Lord Ashworth, and Mrs. Langley have reached an understanding. We expect an announcement before Christmas." The room murmured its approval. Mrs. Langley flushed, smiled, looked at the floor with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite performance. Philip did not move. His face did not change. His hands, behind his back, closed into fists that no one in the room could see. Eleanor saw only the front of him, the gray coat and the locked jaw, and the eyes that did not meet hers. She felt the room tilt gently, the way a boat tilts when the wind changes, and she understood that the wind had changed, and that she was, again, on the wrong side of it. She left the drawing room quietly. She found her coat on the hook by the servants' entrance, where Mrs. Baines always hung it, and she put it on, and she walked out into the October dark without saying goodbye to Adah, which was the hardest part, and without saying goodbye to Philip, which was the part she had been practicing for 15 years. The next morning she wrote a letter to Mrs. Baines declining further lessons. She cited a commitment to another family, which was not true. She sealed the letter and walked it to the hall, and left it with the footman at the side entrance, and walked home in the thin autumn light with her music case empty and her hands raw from the cold. She was packing the last of her sheet music into the case that evening when someone knocked at her door. She opened it and found Adah standing on the step, her coat buttoned wrong and her hair loose, breathing hard as though she had run the 2 miles from the hall. "You cannot leave," Adah said. "You cannot. You are the only one who plays with me. You are the only one who listens." "Adah, does your father know you are here?" "I do not care if he knows. I care that you are leaving. Everyone leaves. My mother left. You do not get to leave." Eleanor knelt on the step. She took Adah's hands, which were cold, and held them, and she said, "I am not leaving Hartwell. I am only stopping the lessons. You are ready to practice on your own now." "I am not," Adah said. "And you know I am not. You are leaving because of what my grandmother said, about the engagement." Eleanor said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Adah pulled her hands free, and her face crumpled, and she turned and ran back down the street before Eleanor could stop her. Eleanor sat on the step for a long time after the child had gone. The street was empty. The apothecary's lamp burned below her window, and the smell of camphor and dried lavender rose through the floorboards. And she pressed her hands together in her lap, and held them there the way she held everything, tightly, so it would not shake. The Michaelmas assembly was 3 days later. Eleanor did not intend to go. She had laid out her dress and then folded it again and put it away, and she had spent the afternoon at her window watching the village prepare. The bunting hung across the inn's facade, and the chairs carried in from the schoolroom, and she had told herself that she did not need to be there. Adah came to her door again at 4 o'clock, properly dressed this time, and with Mrs. Baines behind her. "Miss Prescott," Mrs. Baines said, "Miss Adah asks that you accompany her to the assembly this evening. His lordship is aware, and has given his consent." Eleanor looked at Adah, who looked back at her with the steady, undeniable gaze of a child who has decided to win. She went. The long room above the inn was warm and full, and lit with every candle the village possessed. Eleanor stood near the wall with Adah beside her, and she watched the room fill, and she watched Lady Ashworth take her chair by the hearth, and she watched Mrs. Langley settle beside her in a gown of pale blue silk that caught the light and held it. Philip arrived late. He came through the door with rain on his shoulders, and his hair damp and his face set, and he stopped in the doorway and looked across the room until he found Eleanor. She was standing against the far wall in her twice-turned dress, with Adah's hand in hers, and her chin was lifted, and her eyes were steady, and she was not going to look away first. Not this time. He crossed the room. The distance was not great, perhaps 20 feet, and he covered it in 5 strides, and the room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it understands that something is happening that it has not been told to expect. He passed his mother's chair. He passed Mrs. Langley. He passed the Fentons and the curate and Mr. Hargrove of the county bench, and he stopped directly in front of Eleanor and stood there, close enough that she could see the rain still beaded on his collar. "Miss Prescott," he said. His voice carried in the silence, not raised, not lowered, set at the exact pitch of a man who means every syllable to be heard by every person in the room. "There is no engagement. My mother spoke without my knowledge and without my consent." He paused. The room held its breath. Lady Ashworth's hand on the arm of her chair had gone white at the knuckles. "The only woman I would ask to marry me," he said, "is you." 9 words. Eleanor heard them inside her chest before she heard them in the room. The sound they made there was not language. It was the sound of something sealed for 15 years cracking open, the way ice cracks on a river when the first March sun reaches it. Not violently, not gently, with the slow, irrevocable patience of a thing that has been waiting. Philip reached into the breast pocket of his coat and drew out a folded page. The paper was soft, thinned by years of being carried, and Eleanor recognized it before he unfolded it. It was the page from the Clementi Sonata, the page she had left on the piano at the Midsummer Assembly 15 years ago. He had kept it. "I should have said it then," he said, and his voice was no longer level. "I have carried this for 15 years, because I could not say it then, and because I will not fail to say it now." Lady Ashworth rose from her chair. Her face had gone very still, the stillness of a woman whose architecture has been removed from beneath her in the space of 9 words. She looked at her son. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the room, which was looking back at her with the quiet collective recognition of people who have known the truth for longer than they have been allowed to say it. "Philip," she said. Her voice was thin. "This is not what was agreed." "Nothing was agreed, Mother. Nothing was ever agreed." Mrs. Langley stood. She looked at Philip, and something in her face shifted. Not anger, not humiliation. Something closer to relief. The expression of a woman who has been playing a part she did not audition for and has been released from it by someone else's honesty. She inclined her head once to Eleanor. "Miss Prescott," she said, "I wish you well." She gathered her wrap and left the room with her back straight and her chin high, and Eleanor, watching her go, thought that this was the kind of woman who would find her way to the next thing without cruelty and without complaint. The room exhaled. Mrs. Fenton put her hand over her mouth. The curate's wife reached for her husband's arm. Mr. Hargrove of the county bench, who 3 days earlier had called Eleanor the music teacher seated above her station, looked at his shoes and said nothing at all. Adah, who had been standing beside Eleanor through all of it, still holding her hand, looked up at her father and said, "It is about time." Philip looked at his daughter. The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest possible motion, and it was the first time Eleanor had seen anything like amusement on his face in 15 years, and she felt it in her throat like a note struck on a piano she had not known was still in tune. He offered Eleanor his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady and specific. The hand of a man who has made his choice in front of every person whose opinion he was supposed to value, and has found that the only opinion he values is standing in front of him in a twice-turned dress, with her chin lifted and her eyes wet, and her hand, for the first time in 15 years, not trembling. Dunmore Hall in late November was a different house. The fires were lit early, and the curtains drawn against the frost, and the kitchen sent up meals that Mrs. Baines supervised with the particular care of a housekeeper who has waited a long time for the house to feel occupied again. Eleanor moved through the rooms slowly at first, learning their rhythms. The way the morning light came through the east windows of the music room. The way the corridor creaked at the third board from the stairs. The way Adah's laughter returned now in small, bright bursts like birdsong after a long winter, echoed off the plaster ceilings and settled into the walls. The piano had been moved. Philip had asked 2 footmen to carry the broadwood from the music room to the drawing room, where the fire was larger and the light in the evening was warm. Eleanor had not asked for this. She had not needed to. He had watched her shiver at the keys one afternoon in the music room, and the next morning the piano was beside the hearth, and Eleanor had pressed her hand flat against the lid and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, learning the weight of being seen by someone who does not announce it. Adah played every evening now. She was not gifted. Her timing still wandered, and her left hand lagged behind her right, and she played with the earnest, graceless determination of a child who has discovered that music is not a performance and is not a punishment, and is simply a way of being in a room with the people she loves. Eleanor sat beside her on the bench and turned the pages and did not correct her, because there are kinds of playing that are not about the notes. One evening in late November, the first snow fell. It came quietly, without wind, the flakes drifting past the drawing-room window like something the sky had been holding and had finally decided to release. Adah was at the piano. Philip was in the chair beside the fire, reading a letter he had already read twice, the letter from Mr. Thorne confirming that the marriage settlement had been drawn and that Eleanor Prescott of Hartwell Village would, by Christmas, become Lady Ashworth, Countess of Dunmore, and that the living at Hartwell would be settled on her sister Mary's husband, and that the cottage above the apothecary's shop would be kept in her name, in case she ever wanted to visit the rooms where she had learned to survive. Eleanor sat at the piano beside Adah. The Clementi Sonata was open on the stand, the page Philip had carried for 15 years placed back where it belonged. Its creases softened now, the ink faded at the margins. Eleanor touched the keys. She played the opening bars, and the sound filled the room the way firelight fills a room, not by driving out the dark and not by competing with it, simply by being warm in the place where warmth was needed. Adah turned the page. Her small hand moved across the paper with the careful precision of a child who has been trusted with something important and intends to be worthy of it. Philip looked up from his letter. He watched Eleanor's hands on the keys, and he watched his daughter's hand on the page, and the snow fell past the window, and the fire cracked once and settled, and the room held them all in the same warm silence, the silence that is not absence, and is not emptiness, and is simply the sound a house makes when the people inside it have finally come home. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's story found you at a moment when it mattered, leave a word for her. She waited a long time to be heard.